law, was that something that was part of your family's background? Was your dad or anybody else involved in the legal community?
No, my father was a bus driver, my mother a housewife. My grandparents were brought in as semi-slaves by the British sugar cane farmers from India under indentured labor system. So those were my roots. So, and you know, my community sent me to university. When I completed my BA and LLB and approached law firms, we first had to serve a period of articles. So at that time, and later when I qualified and wanted to work in law firms, that is the question the white law firms asked me. Yeah, is your father a businessman? Any lawyers in your family? What kind of business will you bring?
Really?
Yeah, and you're a woman. What if you fall pregnant? And we can't have white secretaries taking instructions from a black person. So that's why I was the first woman in the country to open a law practice on my own. And you know, male colleagues said she's very presumptuous because it was so ingrained in them that a woman cannot manage a law practice.
So how did you keep your sense of humor when all of this sort of perhaps direct and indirect persecution?
You know, maybe it's a survival mechanism when things are so bad. You feel it as a child. You're 4 years old and you see the police, you know, really treating your parents badly. If your parents are insulted, a child is very sensitive to that. And we were not allowed on beaches. Everything was segregated. So I think our own sense of laughter in South Africa, all the African laborers doing very heavy manual work always sang as they worked. I think that we imbibed some of that.
Yeah.
But it's not funny. Torture is not funny. Fighting apartheid, racism were not funny. My husband was detained also under the Terrorism Act. And you weep quietly because you're the wife, you're the woman. But when you face the security police, you're a lawyer. You have to act on his behalf, right? So there are no jokes there. But even people who were detained and they would describe the torture and the little things they did to uphold their own dignity, they would laugh and tell you that. So there's many lessons you learn from people who've suffered so much. I mean, the key person is Mandela, who served 27 years in prison, comes back and is able to forgive and think in terms of building a nation rather than the route of vengeance.
We read historically about apartheid, but I'm not really, in America, hard perhaps to understand. You know, we have our own slavery issues back in the 1860s, but what was it like? Kind of give a flavor for your upbringing in an apartheid world.
I think firstly you grow up thinking that's the normal because you don't know any other kind of society except that you're not allowed to do this and not allowed to do that. But when I was in primary school, so I would have been 10 years or something, and there was a competition on why you would buy South African made goods. This is the heart of apartheid. And so I won a little medal which had a springbok in, which is once again the apartheid symbol. And I heard my teacher say, if she was white, she would have won the money prize. And because she's not, they gave her this medal. And that's when you're aware that there's just unfairness and injustice around you. First you see it in the treatment of your parents, but you grow up happily as a child because we all live together, all different races, all poor. There was great camaraderie and helping one another. So for a child, that's a good environment to grow up in as you grow. And of course, when I went to university, student protesters were shot at. So what we learned at university is the wealth of the country was owned by Anglo-American. So it's the US and UK big business that owned the wealth of the country, which means they were quite happy with the government that was ensuring tons of labor for the mines, keeping the African population uneducated. So you asked me about apartheid. Yeah, these are the ramifications of apartheid. And let me say, when I got a scholarship and came to Harvard in 1981. And Americans would ask me, where are you from? And aren't you Indian? Aren't you from India? I said, no, South Africa. And they would say, South Africa? Is that the country where the blacks are oppressing the white minority, or is it the other way around? Okay. And I, had an understanding of, we pick up what we can. And this is why international exposure is so important. We have to guard against our governments isolating us from the world.
Did you get into law a little bit later in life? What was your timetable personally? Just you get your degree at
my timetable is you graduate from high school, so that's 10 years of primary and high school education, and the government passed a law saying separate Universities Education Act. So Africans had to go, in terms of language groups, to various separate black colleges. Indians, they just created a new college for Indians, but because none of that was ready, we all had to fill in application forms on what it is we want to do at university. This is now still the so-called open university, but nevertheless where people of color were segregated in a potato warehouse from the main campus. That's where we were taught, but nevertheless we still call them open universities. I filled in BA, because what do you know when you're 16 going on 17? But when I completed the BA, I had done 4 law courses in my BA, which would have saved me a year of the LLB. But I could not enter the LLB because the act came into effect. The Minister of Education refused to give me a permit to study further, which would have been the end of my career. But a new ministry was created, the Ministry of Indian Affairs, and they were courting Indians. What can we do for you, and so on. I then applied to that minister. I was living in the suburbs, and I had bus fare just for 1 round trip. The law lectures were early in the morning, 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. And the next lecture was 7 to 8 at night. This is to suit the white law students who were were already at law firms. So I would come in the morning to hang around there till the lecture finished at 8 p.m. What did I do at the time in between? I had no bus fare to go back. I found in the library, up on the shelves in a dusty corner, the Nuremberg law reports. I doubt anybody knew they were there. I doubt anybody opened them. And I started reading them. I was particularly interested in how you bring to justice political, military, and judicial leaders. Let me say to you now that I'm an old retired judge, very few people actually read the actual judgments. So what I knew about Nuremberg is what I read of Prosecutor Jackson's account. I think most people have our knowledge and get fascinated because we had access to his book. So that's what I had. I read these records, and I never knew that one day I would serve in an international court, hearing cases such as that.
You were an activist, anti-apartheid activist. Did the country permit open anti-apartheid activism, and freedom of speech, or was that kind of really retained?
Sorry. Because of the interest of the international community in South Africa, they still functioned as a democracy. That's why we had trials, we had lawyers, and they didn't suppress speech with violence and so on. They allowed speech, although they singled out individuals and silenced them with banning orders, house arrest orders, and so on. But even then, it wasn't the mass of the people that they targeted. They knew their leaders. I functioned as a lawyer. Unusually, I felt I must learn to use the law and in the courts to gain victories for us. So I defended political activists, students, children who were in detention. And I never knew that I was being watched by the security police. I thought they were watching my husband because he was politically involved as an activist. But when we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and they secured release of all these documents, the document that was published in the media, in the newspapers, was the hit list of the Bureau of State Security, and there my name was listed together with very many human rights lawyers. The name of Desmond Tutu himself, Winnie Mandela, Arthur Chaskelson, who became our Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Dalla Oma, who became our first Minister of Justice. Amongst all these names, there was my name there, which surprised me. I'm glad I didn't know about it while I was functioning as a lawyer. So they were watching us and targeting us. They spread lots of rumors about me when they detained my husband. Yeah, that's what they put all kinds of thoughts in his head. So he came out, very suspicious of me. They would suggest that I'm busy having affairs with all kinds of our own colleagues and friends. Yeah.
You actually got involved with the Mandela part of that, and the prisoners at Robben Island as well. How did that connect?
My clients were sentenced, but they were granted leave to appeal, which means I could go to the Robben Island prison and see them, but I could only talk about the case. The hearing was within sight and supposedly out of hearing, but we knew that they listened to everything, because the condition is you can't talk about conditions in prison, you can't talk about anything else but the case. I had managed to get the law reports to them so they could work on their appeal. And I would constantly go there, and we will have some people reading from the record very loudly, and we would hold our own conversation. They wanted to talk about their conditions in prison. And these were that they didn't know what's their rights. They didn't have a copy of the prison regulations. They were being punished for various things. One of them, a lawyer, had drawn up a petition of their grievances, including the fact that they wanted to teach English to their colleagues from the Transkei, and various other requests. And when he handed that petition to the officer commanding the prison, he was sentenced to isolation and spare diet, 6 months. And so he was now separated from the other lot, the other 10 or 13 people, until I went there, and they brought him out. And they were very anxious to see what's his condition. And then I heard about it. How was he able to tell me? We would write a note here, scratch, and talk about something else. Later, I'll tell you, they stopped Mandela and his lawyer from doing that. But in life, you always have to think of a strategy that works. And so, to cut a long story short, they wanted me to bring an application in court. They informed me that Mr. Mandela was not in favor of the idea. He preferred to negotiate the matter because he expected no joy from the apartheid courts. And if we lose, that'll put a ceiling on the matter. And I was pretty young, I think I was 30 or 32. And to take such an important decision, knowing that it was against his advice meant I had to consult. So I consulted lawyers outside, particularly a Jewish lawyer whom I knew, Rolly Arnstein, who was house arrested, not allowed to give any legal advice, so it was a risk to go talk to him. So people like that advised me to go for it. And we did. We won the court action with costs against Robben Island prison. And the judge ruled, remember at that time we had no constitution. We didn't refer to international law, or we referred to common law, which people in the United States are familiar with, so are we, and the UK. So just arguing on common law, we won for them the right to a lawyer. First, they must have a copy of the prison regulations. Secondly, if there's an allegation that they broke a regulation, they must bring a magistrate from the mainland, from Cape Town, and hold a trial. They can't just punish a person. Thirdly, they had a right to study, but not law, anything else but law. They were afraid of lawyers. Yeah. And they had a right to smoke. That was very important in prison in those days. And they had a right to work, but they didn't have right to receive law journals and so on. So on and on it went, but the main thing is the right to a lawyer. And of course that benefited not only the inmates on Robben Island, the political prisoners, and Mr. Mandela, it benefited all prisoners across the country. And when he called me, I'd met him in the crowd, that's all. People ask me, I feel so foolish. I don't have a picture with him, because the picture taken is the back of my head and his face greeting me. But in that visit, there were hundreds of people around, and I said to him, Mr. President, before I could say it, he said, I know you, Mrs. Pillay. This is a person who had never met me. But of course, if you're a prisoner and there's some young woman has come there and tried something that had not been tried before, I do believe that he had that in mind when he called me one day on my kitchen phone to say, it gives me great joy to congratulate you on being a judge. It's an acting judge position. I hope it will be permanent soon. So that's why I was the first woman of color to be a judge on the High Court.
So Nelson Mandela, this is 1995, right?
Yes,
he
yes.
comes to power, and he nominated you as the first non-white woman to serve on the High Court of South Africa. So that was the Supreme Court, if you will.
No, at that time it was called the Supreme Court for each province.
I got it. Okay.
They've changed the name now, it's High Court.
And at this time a lot was going on when Mandela was released and the negotiations. And were you in the middle of any of that governmental sort of upheaval, change of what was going on in South Africa in 93, 94, 95?
No, I was not, but I knew many of my colleagues were involved, human rights lawyers, politicians. I was not, because I am not a member of the party, African National Congress. They were specially chosen to engage in all this. However, it was the women who got together first. So I was a member of the Women's National Coalition. In 92, we all met. It was very difficult at first, because you're now speaking to women from the Afrikaanse, Nederlands Church, and so on. Women who wanted to maintain the minority of women because they didn't want to hurt their husbands. So women from different aspects. The fact that we got together and came up with a document on what it is we wanted was very important for us. It's a charter, and eventually, and of course we consulted women on the ground for that. That, to our delight, was all included in the Bill of Rights. So I feel that in that way, I played a role, I contributed towards us getting an equality clause in the Constitution, towards us getting the right of sexual orientation in the Constitution, and to limit the right of traditional law, because we have traditional leaders, who still believe in virginity testing and the inequality of women. So we were instrumental in making sure that the equality clause will trump the rights of the traditional leaders.
You, shortly after becoming a member of the High Court, was elected by the United Nations.
Well, there again, I just finished my term when President Mandela nominated me to the UN General Assembly. This is South Africa being received again in the United Nations as a democratic state. First nomination by South Africa to a very high level position. It's a USG level. And I had indicated that yes, I will be interested, but then I was horrified that it was a 4-year term. I felt that I would like to remain right here in my country to play a role. We fought so hard for the change we wanted, and I wanted to play a role, and very few of us left home. We loved our country. In fact, for long afterwards, people would say, why did the government send you so far? Can't you ask them to send you back? So I went with friends saying, well, go. If you don't like it, you can resign. So I went with the idea that I will resign within a year. 8.5 years later, I continued. And why? Because I asked myself exactly, what is it that you are complaining about when the witnesses, particularly women, are saying to you as witnesses, we've waited for this day to see justice being done.
When does your paths cross with Richard Goldstone, who was the chief founding prosecutor of the Rwanda tribunal? Did you know him beforehand?
Oh yes, he was a well-known judge because he made one ruling that almost ended the application of the Group Areas Act, the segregation and ejectment of people. And so I knew he was in Johannesburg as a young judge, and he made that decision. So I knew of him. I was in a different province, a city of Durban. And when he was the prosecutor and I was elected as a judge, then Judge Kisesa, who was the president of the Yugoslav tribunal and president of the appeals chamber of both ad hoc tribunals, privately asked me, are you thinking of being the president of the Rwanda tribunal? And I said, oh no, I'm very new. I don't know much about international law, and I'm really a very inexperienced judge, so I have no such ambitions. And he said, good, because Richard Goldstone is from South Africa. He's a prosecutor, and we can't have a South African as the president. Although we couldn't communicate, I was judge and he was president, I regarded him as my senior because he was already a judge of the Constitutional Court. So it was very strange when he presented the very first indictment to me as the judge. And it's amazing when you're a judge, out of the sawdust of fighting as defense lawyer or prosecution, you do have a perspective of the whole picture. There was some aspect I was able to point out to him, such as if you're asking for a sealed indictment against 4 persons, how are you ever going to serve this? Mm-hmm. Because you have to find them individually and serve them. And I remember him saying, yes, yeah, that's right. So historic that a South African prosecutor, a South African judge, he presented the indictment, and I issued the first indictments in the Rwanda tribunal.
Now that
we've remained friends, we work very well together.
Now he was there for as chief prosecutor for 3 or 4 years, I'm sure, and then he left, and there was a successor. Is that when you were interested in becoming president? Did you become president, Judge?
Yeah. Oh no, I was never interested in becoming president. In fact, you could see the story of my life. I was never interested. I didn't apply for any of these positions. Richard Goldstone served 2 years as prosecutor because President Mandela agreed to his release from the Constitutional Court. It's the highest court in our country. He was needed there. So he spared him for 2 years. And Richard Goldstone had to, at the end of 2 years, listen to that. The court expanded, I was the only woman for 4 years. At the end of 4 years, it's those judges, together with the appeals judges, all elected me president. So that's how that happened.
So it says your tenure on the ICTR is best remembered for your role in the landmark trial of Jean-Paul
Akayesu.
Thank you. Which established that rape and sexual assault could constitute acts of genocide. Did you get a sense at the time of the ruling that that was historic?
Oh yes, because rape and sexual violence had not been prosecuted as crimes. Even in Nuremberg or the Tokyo Tribunal, there were minor little attempts made in the Tokyo Tribunal that the general had not stopped sexual violence, but it was never charged. I saw some US military manuals. They were brought to me by a visiting judge from the military justice establishment, and she gave me those manuals, and I could read through those lines and see how they trained soldiers and so on. That, that's your reward. You go and fight well, you can have all those yellow women. That's not just the United States position, but all over the world in conflicts. They did not regard what happens to women and children and the sexual violence as crimes. I attribute this to old British laws anyway. Old British laws had that attitude to women, that a man could beat his wife as long as the rod was no thicker than the thumb. That's why rule of the thumb. So I was very aware of these issues, and we had read the report of the commission that was called for by the Security Council before they set up the tribunal, and that recorded sexual violence. But NGOs asked me, how come out of 30-something indictments there isn't a single count of rape? So always civil society, the activism alerts you to issues. I said to them, this was at a big public meeting, I said to the person who asked me the question, you'll have to ask the prosecutor. I'm a judge, I can't influence the indictment, which is the normal thing that judges say because of the separation of our jobs. But we were dealing with genocide. We're seeing things in the context of that conflict. So when witnesses volunteered testimony of sexual violence, I asked the first question of the witness, indicating that we want to hear that evidence, even though it's not charged. My two colleagues, the judge from Sweden and the judge from Senegal, also jumped in and asked the questions. And this witness was saying her 6-year-old daughter had been raped, and she knows the 3 men who did it. And then she herself had been raped. The prosecutor tried to stop her. He said, well, I didn't ask you that. He was concerned that evidence was not in her statement. Now, of course, it was not in her statement because they never asked her. Witness after witness told us this, but they didn't ask me. And then the prosecutor asked for an adjournment, had the matter investigated and applied to amend the charge to add those 4 counts of rape and sexual violence. And then as I was writing that part of the judgment, I realized that there is no internationally accepted definition of rape and sexual violence in international law. Each country had their own. Most countries had the traditional definition that rape only happens to the female when the male penis enters her vagina. That constitutes rape and nothing else. So that's when, with the help of especially here academics in the US, Professor McKinnon, Jessica Neuwirth from Harvard Law School, with their help, I wrote the new definitions, which is gender neutral. And it's been carried forward in the Rome Statute. It's been adopted by 2 states here. I forget which 2 states in the United States, yeah. And it's been applied by the South African Constitutional Court, because we still have the old definition. What was before the court was a 4-year-old boy had been sexually molested, but the sentence was very little if it's a boy victim, whereas if it was a girl child, it would have been a heavier penalty. And so the lower courts kicked it up to the Constitutional Court, and Judge Richard Goldstone told me that he alerted his colleagues to look at the Akayesu decision, which they then cited, and ordered the government to change the law, because the victim, whether a boy or a girl, suffers the same.
You were quoted as saying, from time immemorial, rape has been regarded as spoils of war. Now it will be considered a war crime. We want to send out a strong signal that rape is no longer a trophy of war.
You know, that's an accurate quote, but of course I didn't say it in my judgment.
No, but
it's when media comes to you
Yeah.
and wants that personal note. It's true, I stand by it.
You then become the UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon nominates you to succeed Louise Arbour as the High Commissioner of Human Rights. That's the #1 job at the United Nations.
Yes. May I say, before we done with the Rwanda tribunal, the other groundbreaking cases, you know, one can sometimes judge our success, shall I say, by how many times you hit the front page of the New York Times. So I have plaques to remember that. So the other time was the media judgment on freedom of speech. And the only precedent we had was the Eichmann case. And so we spelt out, because this is the media, the owner of the radio station and a journal. And so the media all over the world was watching this case. And many people were deeply concerned that we were now handing it to dictators in Africa to suppress the media. So we had to spell out the law very, very carefully. And both my decisions, you know, it's not my decision, we're a panel of 3 judges. Our decisions were upheld on law, and that also made jurisprudential history, because we had to spell out these conventions for the first time. I then was nominated inside my country and selected by the Constitutional Court. It had to be a unanimous decision of the highest court, and they sent it to President of the country then, Thabo Mbeki, and I was nominated for the position in the International Criminal Court. And I was elected by the Assembly of State Parties. I served 5 years there, and that's when it happened that I was interviewed by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he asked me to start immediately, almost, and I said I will never resign as a judge. And of course, sure I did, when he explained how urgent it was that he has a High Commissioner for Human Rights in. And there I served 6 years. It's usually a 4-year term. Mine was extended at the request of all the states. And after 6 years, I then retired. I'm now in retirement.
You've done a lot. At the International Criminal Court, were you there when they just commenced the tribunal?
Oh yes, I was one of the first 18 judges.
And so Prosecutor Ocampo was the first one for the ICC?
Yes, he was the first prosecutor.
You sort of connect a lot of dots here today.
That's right. What I'm pleased about the International Criminal Court is I was on the appeals bench, and we made new rulings, decisions on the rights of victims, their access to participate in the courtroom. This was all new to me. It's new to common law system. It doesn't happen in my country. So very progressive decisions which advanced justice internationally that were still not available, are still not available in my own country. So I'm pleased with that.
Was Hans-Peter Kaul, was he at the court at the time you were there?
Yes, we were good friends, and I'm really sorry that he died before seeing the erection of the new court.
He spoke here a couple of times, and we were his guests in Germany, he and his wife. So that in your role as in the United Nations, what was the big challenge? They really were excited about having you, but for the camera, what was the necessity that they really wanted somebody of your voice?
They wanted somebody to deliver on that mandate. I know people said you have a lot of courage to be criticizing governments, but it's not courage that is involved in such a job. I'm a judge. I look at the mandate and said these are the things I can do and I'm expected to do by governments and by civil societies, and that is to address all human rights of all persons all over the world. So when I was told do not touch Tibet because that's a political matter, then I looked into the matter, because who's looking after the rights of people in Tibet and other pockets of territories that have just been forgotten. And when I was told do not introduce new international norms and standards that are not internationally accepted, I knew they were referring to LGBTI. For 60 years it had never been addressed as an international issue, and so I put it on the agenda. The importance of having a High Commissioner for Human Rights is the power to listen to civil society, listen to states, see what the problems are, and put it on the agenda for the attention of states. New things I did are economic rights, because the right to development and economic rights are crucial for where I come from, developing countries. There was an overwhelming emphasis on civil and political rights, but not on economic rights. And today we all realize how relevant that is. So that would be something new I focused on. The protection of human rights defenders would be another, and LGBTI, and also to address the caste system, which India said is an internal matter and not an international matter. But there was caste discrimination in various countries, in Mauritania, outside Japan. So I brought those issues on the table, and one of the last things I did is to focus on North Korea. And so we had a commission of inquiry set up in North Korea, and it was headed by the Australian judge, Michael Kirby. And I'm still involved in focusing on the terrible human rights violations in North Korea. It troubled me that certain areas or certain countries seem to escape scrutiny. I didn't want to be a High Commissioner that constantly goes after states that are trying to do something. Of course, we encourage them to do something, but I was true to addressing all issues that people care about, and calling upon governments to carry out their obligations, including powerful governments such as the United States. I did not differentiate between governments, and I had to do the job without fear and without favor.
Well, you bring up the point, doing your job without fear or favor. At what point you must have felt the real politics, of it all. How do you defend that? I mean, how deflect that? How do you keep that independence, which is your charter, but it's there?
That's the reality within which we worked, and that's why this morning at the Jackson Center, where I'm here now, I spoke about the geopolitical agenda of governments. They either follow the interests of their own region or their own country, or they protect their friends. That's the hypocrisy I saw at the United Nations at the highest level. So both in my addresses before the Security Council or the General Assembly, I had the voice. Because, I don't have the voice now, I'm retired, but once you're a High Commissioner for Human rights, that's what the mandate says, that you have to draw attention and call upon all governments to carry out the very treaties that they themselves adopted. I felt that I was on moral high ground to make that call. I'm not saying that we met with success. There was a lot of resistance, a lot of, the UN security kept a record of all the threats and the death threats, especially coming from the pro-Israel lobby, not the Israeli government, because they invited me to visit Israel. They said I was balanced. I presented their point of view. But there are lobbies out there, extremist lobbies, who will criticize you. Perhaps my experience of growing up under apartheid made me resilient to stick to the principles.
You're amazing. You're amazing. You've accomplished so much, and I'm just so thrilled you joined us. What's the question I should be asking you that I forgot?
Oh, gosh, I can't get into your brain. See, what's the question? What were you going to... Well, I mentioned the media case to you here. Well, all right. So then I when I was retiring, I truly felt this is retirement, and people must just leave me alone, because really, honestly, that job as High Commissioner is like an 18-hour job, day and night, with endless reports and meetings, and you have to meet governments and victims all over, and you have to visit all these countries. I think it was terribly onerous to put all that responsibility on one individual. So at the end of it, you won't be surprised when I said, leave me alone, I'm just going to lie on the beaches of Durban. But here I am in my 5th year of retirement, because human rights violations are continuing. I'm dedicated and committed to international justice, and I'm continuing to do whatever I can to speak up on these issues.